When we talk about Keynesian aggregate demand and aggregate supply, one of the few things that we have to keep in mind is the life and times of John Maynard Keynes. He lived through the Great Depression, and to fully understand his philosophies and his theories, we have to know a few things about, depression and recession in general. The chart that shows the last 15-20 years of employment level in USA. You can see whenever we had a recession, the unemployment can go plummet all the way down to around roughly 10% during 2008 and 9 financial crisis. And during COVID, we can see that the unemployment rate is actually very, very high. 6-7% or even 8% might not make a big impact if you think about it from a percentage perspective. However, if you're looking at a population of more than 5-6 million, even that small percentage can account to a large population. So during recessions we tend to have a very high rate of unemployment, which would mean that we have surplus labor. So the supply of labor is actually very, very, very high, or there is a lot of excess labor in the economy that are willing to work and just cannot find work. So the supply, we have a surplus. We have surplus amount of labor, relatively speaking, hanging around, since you have almost double the rate of unemployment during recession. Another key characteristics of recessions in general is that we tend to have very low aggregate demand, and that is because during recessions consumption drops, investment drops, and if consumption and investment drops, naturally there is going to be a very, very low aggregate demand. And for that reasons, firms and producers, in order to stay profitable, they don't want to increase the prices because the demand for the goods is actually very low to start with. These are the few things that it is important to keep in mind when we talk about aggregate demand and supply in the Keynesian theory. Now let's get back to our classical model, which we briefly went through in our previous video. I went through the logic of why the classicals tend to prefer aggregate supply and the movement along the aggregate supply and the shift in aggregate supply more important than aggregate demand. And I discussed that in the classical model, the only way to increase our output in the economy is by shifting the aggregate supply towards the right, which essentially means by increasing factors of production, by increasing output and production level, we can increase our GDP in the economy and relatively keep our prices, to reduce our prices. Any movement along the aggregate demand curve would cause an upward pressure on prices and would not increase GDP, would keep the GDP constant. So let's say if we move the aggregate demand, our GDP level would still remain exactly the same. It is only the prices which would increase. Let's try to understand the same logic, because we have to keep in mind that the Keynesian system is a modification of the classical system. In no way does Keynes completely disregard or completely disagree with the classical model. It's just a modification of the classical model in the short run. When we think about perfectly comparative labor market in a classical model, we say that the prices in the economy are set where the marginal productivity of labor, meaning the next as we hire more labor, how much are we increasing the productivity per labor. So let's say that we hire 5 laborers and 5 laborers are producing, let's say, 10 units. If let's say 6 laborers are producing 15 units, then the marginal productivity of labor would be 5. That extra labor is adding 5 more additional equipments. Theoretically speaking, when we divide that by wages, we are supposed to get the prices in the economy. And if we can rearrange the formula, for to make wages a subject, marginal productivity of labor divided by the prices in the economy should give us, in the classical model at least, the wages in the market. In the classical model, as you can see, and this is what was happening during the earlier stage of the Great Depression, where the government was constantly trying to increase output in the economy, and the assumption was if the output increases, the GDP should theoretically increase, and we should be able to come out of the depression. However, as you can see from the formula, when the production level increases, if the marginal productivity of labor increases, theoretically speaking, if let's say that our units of production, let's say the price in the economy are let's say $5, and let's say we are producing 10 units of product in the economy. Let's say the government implements some sort of supply side policy in the classical sense to increase marginal product of labor, and let's say that from 10 units now we are able to produce 15 units. And if the prices decrease, because when the aggregate supply increases, theoretically in the classical model you can see that the prices should fall. So if the prices, let's say, decreases, this should, theoretically speaking, increase our wages in the economy. The wages would go to $7.5, whereas previously it would have been only $2. The wages would increase, and therefore the economy should come out of the depression. This was the logic during the first half of the Great Depression, and this is exactly what Keynes argued against. Keynes argued that in the short run, at least in the very short run sense, the wages in the market tend to be very sticky. So theoretically, even though the wages are supposed to increase, they will not increase due to some key factors. Let me just quickly remove this. Okay, so the first thing, that wages is equal to marginal productivity of labor divided by prices. Keynes argued that during depressions or during recessions, wages tend to be very constant, and the prices in the economy and the productivity in the economy, or the marginal productivity of labor, is also constant, and therefore the prices would not change even if we try to improve the aggregate supply in the economy. He argued that in the short run, if I were to draw a simple graph, at least in the very short run, the aggregate supply would remain constant and the prices also would remain constant. This is due to the fact that in the short run we have something called as sticky wages. Now, what does sticky wages mean? When there is an increase in production level, or when we have recession, we have a high unemployment, we have a high surplus of labor. Since the labor is in high quantity, since we have high level of unemployment, most laborers would be, rationally speaking, or from common sense, would be willing to work at a lower price. Let's say that in a household, let's say we have 5 individuals, and let's say 5 individuals, all 5 of them work, and they accumulatively get $50 of income to the entire house. Let's say that the economy is going through depression, and from these 5 individuals, now only one of them is working, and you're getting a total income level in the house of $10. The other 4 individuals are not working, and let's say that an employer is trying to hire more workers, and the employer reaches out to these 4 individuals and asks them to join the company. What do you think these 4 individuals would do? Previously, they had a total income of $50. Now they only have $10. Rationally speaking, if you think about common sense, they would be willing to work at a very low wage. They would be willing to accept a very low wage, and they would not ask for a wage increase in a way that we understand in the classical model. In the classical model, as I said, as the production increases, theoretically speaking, prices drop, and theoretically speaking, wages are supposed to increase. Keynes argues that no, in the short run, the wages do not increase. The wages remain either constant, or in many cases, they can even decrease. So these 4 individuals would be willing to work at a lower wage. If the previous income per person was $10, they would be willing to work for that $10 so that they can get that $50 of income in the house again. So if you think about common sense, during a recession, individuals, because of high unemployment, are willing to work for a lower wage and would not really ask for a wage increase because they don't really have enough income and they want to get something. It's better to get something than not to get anything. Another thing, Keynes argued that during recession we have high. So one of the, okay, we'll get to that in a second. Another reason why wages do not increase in recession is because of contracts. Most companies usually have around 1 year to 1 year to 2 year contract for their labor. And if the labor has agreed to a contract, let's say the labor has agreed to a contract in 2019, and let's say the contract will last until 2020. If we have a recession in 2020, then it would not work out. Even if we have a recession, the firm is supposed to pay the wages that they have agreed in the contract, regardless whether the recession exists, doesn't exist. They have to complete the agreement of the contract. And therefore, in the short run, at least in the very short run, because of contract or legal issues, the wages in the economy remain constant or they do not increase. Another factor why we tend to have sticky wages in the short run is due to reputation. Many companies do not want to change their wages because they know that it's going to impact the labor. Let's say that your salary was in a let's say a labor salary in a factory was, let's say, $5,000 per year, and for some reason, due to recession, now the wages are supposed to change. However, the company's policy could be, hey, we need to maintain our reputation. We cannot fire labor. We cannot hire more labor immediately. We cannot just randomly change the wages every 6-7 months. So to maintain a good reputation, or to keep a stable reputation, or maybe it could be the company's policy not to change wages, or company's policy not to fire or hire a lot of labor immediately, because you have to understand that at the end of the day, labor are human beings, and as a manager, you don't want to just keep on firing and hiring just because the economics or the math says we need to hire or fire more or less labor. And for that reason, in the short run at least, wages tend to be sticky, or wages do not really increase a lot in the economy. And this is something that we have to constantly keep in mind when you think about Keynesian aggregate demand and supply curve. Another factor that Keynes argued, at least in the short run, he argued that the production level stays constant because of sticky wages. Let me just quickly erase all of this. So another factor that Keynes argued, that in the short run, or at least in the very short run, wages stay constant and our production also stays constant, or at least doesn't increase by a lot. That is because if you think about it, during a recession, the companies are not making a lot of profit. And let's say for some reason, the company wants to increase price. Why would they want to increase the price? The only possible reason could be because there is excess demand in the economy. People are willing to pay more for the product. But during a recession, since there is already drop in aggregate demand, we tend to have a lot of inventories. So inventories during recessions increases because you have excess stock. No one's buying the stock because we have excess stock. No one wants to buy the stock because everyone in the economy is pessimistic, and since they are pessimistic, they just don't want to spend a lot of money. They want to save a lot of money because, again, they are pessimistic, and the inventories tend to rise. Even if we increase production theoretically, by increasing aggregate supply in the economy, it would only account for inventory. It would not translate into actual consumers buying the product. This is against the classical notion. Classical notion says that as soon as we increase inventory, as soon as we increase production, theoretically, people would buy the equipment or buy the products, and therefore the income in the economy would increase. But Keynes argues that actually, if we increase production during recessions or during depressions, it would only account for inventories, and the aggregate demand would still remain, the income in the economy or the output in the economy would remain constant, or at least it won't increase by much, because individuals are pessimistic in the economy. And with these two key factors, we can then draw our, at least in the very short run. I'm constantly repeating the word short run because the Keynesian economics in the long run does not stay as valid as we would expect. At least in the short run, due to these two factors, due to wages being constant and our marginal productivity of labor being constant, our prices also remain constant, and therefore the aggregate supply in the economy remain constant in the very short run at least. Let's say that the theoretical output level of the economy was somewhere over here. as we understand from by our classical notion, if we employ all the factors of production, if we employ land, labor, enterprise, and capital, let's say that this is all equal to 50 units, and if this is our theoretical output in the long run, if this is the long run, in the short run at least, the aggregate supply would remain constant. But as the time period increases, you will see that the sticky wages don't tend to be that sticky, meaning as the time increases, individuals can change their contracts, individuals can slowly become more and more optimistic, and therefore they could ask for higher pay increases. So therefore in the long run, the wages or the prices in the economy go back to as we understand it from the classical notion. So Keynesian economics is essentially discussing the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply from a perspective of a short-term perspective. Keynes argues that in the short run, by increasing aggregate supply, let's say that the aggregate supply is somewhere over, let's say the supply is somewhere over here. In the short run, if we increase our aggregate supply, let's say this is AS to, let's say some another point, let's say this is Y0, this is our potential, let's call it YP, potential output. If this is our Y0, this is our Y1. Let's say if we can draw the aggregate demand in the economy. So this is, let's just say this is our aggregate demand. In the short run, by increasing aggregate supply, we would not have any impact on prices, and we would not have any impact on the output in the economy because prices are constant. If you look at it from classical perspective, if the aggregate supply increases, it would have no impact on the total output in the economy, even because the prices are constant. If the prices are constant, we will stick to our same equilibrium point. We will stick to our same equilibrium point of P1 Y0, even though theoretically, according to the classical model at least, we should be increasing aggregate output in the economy, but because the prices are constant in the short run, we have no impact on the aggregate output. However, if in the long run, if we increase it, it would have an impact. This is why Keynes argues that in the short run, or at least in the very short run, if we want to influence our output in the economy, we have to increase aggregate demand. And the only way we can increase aggregate demand is through fiscal government policies, or is through fiscal policies in general. In no way am I saying that the classical model is invalid. It is very valid in the long run. However, in the short run, it is the aggregate demand that plays an important role. To summarize it again, Keynes doesn't disagree with the classical notion. Keynes simply argues that the classical model in the short run doesn't apply, and he argues that in the short run, because of sticky wages, and because of inventories accumulation, if we increase aggregate supply in the short run, it will have no impact on the output level. The only way we can increase output in the short run is by increasing aggregate demand. And this was a key difference from classical notion. Classicals argue that the only way we can increase aggregate output in the economy is by increasing aggregate supply. Although in the long run, the Keynes model comes back to the classical system, but Keynes argues that in the long run, since everyone would be dead, it doesn't really matter to study the long run. We have to instead focus on the short run. That doesn't mean that the Keynesian economics completely overshadows classical economics. It's just that it's a modification of classical economics. And if we can understand these two concepts, we can understand why the aggregate supply is constant in the short run, and as the time goes on, the wages tend to be less sticky and people become more optimistic, so inventories fall, and in the long run we would go back to our long run aggregate supply. In the next video, we'll talk about how do we derive aggregate demand in the classical how do we derive aggregate demand in the Keynesian system. We studied in the previous video that the aggregate demand in the classical system is simply an aggregate of individual demand, and if we can factor in the wealth effect, we get the aggregate demand in the classical notion. However, for Keynesian models, we have to study the ISLM curve. Let's study ISLM curve to fully understand how the aggregate demand is derived.